Hello. It's working. Welcome and welcome. So I will say a few words to introduce Bence and Nanay. Bence. Nanay. Bence and Nanay.
If you know the Greek zi, that's
No, I don't. I can't. So, Bence and Nanay is professor of philosophy and co-director of the Center for Philosophical Psychology at the University of Antwerp and senior research associate at Peterhouse, Cambridge University. He is the primary investigator of the Between Perception and Action project at the University of Antwerp, supported by a €1 million grant from Flemish Research Foundation. He is also the primary investigator of the Seeing Things You Don't See project, supported by a €2 million consolidator grant from the European Research Council. Professor Nanay has published around 150 scholarly articles in 4 languages in journals such as Journal of Philosophy, Philosophical Studies, Analysis, Mind and Language, Journal of Mind and Behavior, Studies in the History and Philosophy of Science, and Philosophical Psychology. He has published 3 single-author books on aesthetics and philosophy of perception from Oxford University Press, among also other edited books and co-authored books. So, one thing I will say before we begin, if you have questions, please reserve your questions until the talk ends, and then we will have a Q&A session, right? You can ask your questions about the talk. So, today, Bence will talk to us about the fragmented mind, so let's welcome him.
Merhaba. So I fully realize that my name is funny. And I also suspect that some of you might be here for that purpose. Nonetheless, I'm going to try to interest you in something that I think all of us should be interested in, and that's it's an important reason to take philosophy seriously, or the philosophy the way I think about it. So, and I want to say, before I start, I want to say something about how I think about philosophy. So this is what I take to be the traditional philosophical methodology. So there's philosophy, guy thinking. And there's the sciences, look at them in their lab coat. And they just don't interact much. And the idea is that philosophers, they do their thing, they don't pay attention to what the science is doing, and scientists are doing their thing, and they don't pay attention to what philosophy is doing. So recently, things have changed a little bit, and philosophers started to pay attention to what's going on in the sciences. In general, it's a good idea to, if your philosophical theory just blatantly contradicts all the scientific findings, then it's a good idea to just reevaluate it. And I guess you see where this is going. This is supposed to be my methodology, where there's this bidirectional interaction between the sciences and philosophy. So the idea is that philosophy is not just informed by the sciences, but is also relevant to the sciences. So you have this nice interaction. So you might think, all right, that sounds nice, and also conveniently sounding something like you would write in a methodology section of a grant application, which is exactly where this is from. But how does it work, or how could it work? And the reason, one way in which it can work really well is if philosophy combines 2 separate and sometimes somewhat distant scientific subfields. So the idea is that these scientists, they don't, they're busy with their little pipettes and stuff. They don't have time to read up on different subfields. But philosophers, if we have anything, we have time. So we really have time to read up on these 2 different scientific subfields and bring together the findings. And this is exactly what this project is trying to do, where the 2 scientific subfields are social psychology and cognitive science. So, and this talk is going to be about temptations. So, and I think you might think that, or another way of phrasing it is going to be about self-control. And you might think that, well, I don't need to listen to this, I have perfect self-control. So how many of you think that you have no problem with your self-control, you never actually did anything that you didn't want to do, you're always fully exercising your self-control? Is there anyone who thinks that? No, okay. Well, they should talk. I envy you. All right, so all the rest of you, so you can go. It's fine. And I have nothing to say to you. except for being very envious at you. But most of us, we have issues with with self-control, with doing things that we don't actually want to do. So one example is that you're in the bar, if you're into that kind of thing, and then you've already had 4 pints of beer, and then the bartender is offering you a 5th, and then what are you going to do? And you have 2 options. You can say, no, I'm going to resist that temptation. The other thing that you can do is to give in. Say, yeah, sure. The 5th pint, and then 6th, and then 7th. So these seem to be the 2 options that you can do with temptation. You can resist the temptation, or you can yield. But what I want to really focus on is the 3rd option, which is kind of a hidden option that's not really obvious, and that's the avoid temptation. It's not going to the bar at all. So in case we're in a more and more Muslim country, so maybe alcohol is a bad idea. So you can run this with Iran, so everybody can. Well, who am I kidding? There's no such thing as too much Iran. So. All right, so here's another one, and that's actually much more. I mean, alcohol is one thing, but one thing that's even more important for most of you, again, I'm watching you here, is being tempted to do stuff online, and that's something that apparently some 90-something% of the population have serious issues with. That they just spend more time on Facebook than they want to. They spend more time on Twitter than they want to, and so on. So, I'm sure that there's wireless here, and, this is going to get boring in 20 minutes or so, or maybe much earlier than that. And then, I'm sure you have your phone, and you could take it out and try to sneakily check what's going on, get any exciting emails. People liked your post on Facebook, find out. So again, you're going to get tempted. And then you have 2 choices. You can resist the temptation. Just, no, I'm not going to do this. I came here all the way here to Bilkent to listen to this great talk. Or you can give in. You can just do it sneakily. But again, here's the 3rd option. And that's the option that I choose. And it's this. All right. So again, what I want to focus on is this avoiding option. This option when you're not, because what I'm going to try to tell you is that both resisting temptations and giving into temptations are just bad. So the only thing that's not like really terrible option is to avoid temptations, but that's going to be also very difficult. All right. So my starting point is going to be the concept of trait self-control, and that's an important concept in social psychology. You fill out the questionnaire, and then you're on the basis of the questionnaire, the psychologist, the psychiatrist is assigned to you a trait self-control, and that's going to be your trait self-control. And they ask you questions like, how many times a day do you check your phone, and has it happened to you in the last month that you got wasted, although you didn't want to get wasted, and so on. So on the basis of this, and this is something that's used a lot in, especially in the addiction practices. On the basis of this questionnaire, you get this trait self-control that's a numeric value. And one important assumption that social psychologists make about this concept is that it's constant. So most of you are in your 20s, I guess, so you have a trait self-control, so that's a value about how good you are at self-control. And that's going to be the same when you're in your 30s, and your 40s, and your 50s, and so on. So this doesn't change. This is what you're going to have to work with. And this assumption is there in serious scientific articles, as well as the kind of big pop psychological narratives that you encounter. And then the idea is that what's happening is that it's your childhood experiences that fixes your trait self-control. So depending on how your parents raised you, whether they gave you a lot of candy or not, and so on, that's going to fix your trait self-control, and that's what you're going to have to work with throughout your life. And then if your trait self-control is low, if you're bad at controlling your urges, then you're going to be unsuccessful in your life. That's what many of these pop psychological narratives are talking about. You're going to end up divorced, or homeless, and drug addict, and so on. And if you have a high trait self-control, then you're a successful lawyer making a lot of money and running for president. So I think this is an extremely, first of all, there's a very problematic assumption, but it's also an extremely dangerous assumption, because if you are told that your trait self-control is fixed, that there's this ceiling that you can't just go above, then it's very easy to just kind of throw up your arm and say that, well, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing, it's not my fault if I get wasted tonight. It's my parents' fault for raising me badly, and they kind of messed up my trait self-control. There's nothing I can do about it. So it's a very not just a false narrative, but also a dangerous narrative. And here's one aspect of this that I'm sure that you've seen before, but I want to walk you through it because it's a very misleading general narrative. So you've heard about the marshmallow experiments? How many of you have heard about the marshmallow experiments? Wow, okay, cool. So the idea is that this is a very cruel thing to do with a child. Look at him, seriously. So the way it works, for those of you who don't know it, is that the child is sitting in an empty room. There's an empty table in front of him. There's a plate on the table and one marshmallow there. And they can eat that marshmallow, and that's it. They can just go home. Or they can wait for 3 minutes, 5 minutes, they vary this. And then they get 2 marshmallows. And then so, what you gonna do? And the reason why this kind of made the big airwaves is that what the researchers found, these were done in the 70s, and so they kind of followed up on this. They followed these people, the subjects around, and so how they did in life. And what they found is that those people, at least that's the claim, anyway, those people who waited for the second marshmallow, they ended up much more successful in all kinds of spheres of life than the ones that gave in and just ate the first marshmallow. So that again, that you can see how that kind of plays into this narrative that low self-control, your life is going to be terrible. High self-control, your life is going to be glorious. So there's a lot of problems with the marshmallow experiment, and I'm happy to talk about it. There's a huge replication problem, first of all. There's various alternative explanations, like really what explains the fact that people are going for the marshmallow or not is something like the lack of stability in their life. They can't be sure that the experiment is going to come back and so on. But what I really want to, the reason why I mention this is because I want to make this important distinction between two conceptions of self-control. The self-control is really an ability to resist temptation, or is it an ability to avoid temptation? And as you can see, in the marshmallow case, what's going on there, and it's not an option to avoid it. The marshmallow is right there, staring in your face. It's about resisting. So whatever the marshmallow experiment shows, and I personally think that it doesn't show anything, but if it does show something, it must show something about the ability to resist. But self-control, and especially trait self-control, that is not measuring the ability to resist temptation, it measures the ability to avoid temptation. So in fact, those people who have high trait self-control, they often are not very good at resisting temptation. What they're good at is that not putting themselves in a position when they're going to find it difficult to resist temptation. But when they are in that kind of situation, then they can be terrible at it. So forget about the whole marshmallow thing. That doesn't show anything, and if it does, it shows something about the wrong thing. It shows something about the ability to resist and not the ability to avoid. So, but then the problem is this. So it turned, again, what the focus of this talk is this third hidden option. When you're not resisting a temptation, you're not giving in to the temptation, but you're avoiding the temptation. And the question is, what is that? How to do that? And here is here's the kind of first stab at it, kind of a very simple way of understanding what that means. Avoiding temptation is really just avoiding those kinds of situations where there's my desire to do something and there's my self-image about what I think of myself, and they're in conflict. So when I'm tempted to check my phone, my self-image is probably not that, I can't even sit through a half an hour talk without checking my phone, but nonetheless, my desire is to check my phone. So there's this contradiction between what I think of myself and my desire. And in the fifth pint case as well, there's this contradiction between my desire for the fifth pint and my self-image, that I'm not the kind of person who gets wasted on a regular basis. So avoiding temptation is avoiding these situations when there's this contradiction between my desires and my self-image. But the problem is that as long as there is this kind of contradiction between your desires in general and your self-image, then sooner or later you are going to find yourself in situations when the contradictions are going to become salient, because temptation is everywhere. So really the only way that you can kind of consistently and systematically avoid temptations is to have some kind of mindset where your desires are in tune with your self-image. So that's, and again, I made this kind of number of steps here. So trait self-control, which is what this talk is really about, is really the same thing as the ability to avoid temptation. And the ability to avoid temptation it relies on some kind of lack of contradiction between your desires and your self-image. So now you can kind of connect these things up, and really what's going to amount to is that trait self-control, what that measures, if it measures anything, is the degree of the tension between your desires and your self-image. And I want to use the metaphor of fragmentation to describe this. So, it's the middle of the talk, so time to liven things up. Cute puppies, aren't they cute? So imagine a huge old mansion with a lot of cute puppies running around in it. They're just frolicking about, running from one room to the other. Isn't that nice? But now imagine this. There's this nasty security guard who's just blocking the way of these cute little dogs, and they don't let them go from one room to the other. You can see what's good and what's bad here, and what fragmentation is supposed to mean. The puppies are really supposed to mean it's like your thoughts and desires and various mental states. And the nasty security guard is what the fragmentation is doing. So the mind can be more or less fragmented, which means that the mind, there can be more or less interaction between different parts of your, different mental states of yours. And as the little metaphor is supposed to show, the more fragmented it is, the worse that's going to be, and that's what's supposed to be the main aim of the talk, to talk you through that. So if your mind is fragmented, then when something's going on in some part of your mind, some other parts of your mind just have no idea about this. So there are kind of harmless cases of this. So I'm sure it happened to you that you made an appointment for Tuesday afternoon with your dentist, and then you forgot that on Tuesday afternoon you're supposed to meet with a student or something like that, and you made this plan separately, and you didn't realize that there's this blatant contradiction between your two plans until the last moment. Has this happened to you ever? Not to you, I'm sure. Sorry, cheap shot. So, but these are kind of harmless examples. But there are more, there are kind of less harmless examples, and I want to focus on those in the next couple of minutes. But if you're sometimes, some people, their mind is less fragmented. So the idea is that when there's more of an interaction between the mental states. So if, for example, in terms of what I talked about, when I talked about the ability to avoid temptations, whether the desires are in tune with the rest of your mind, that would be, if they're more in tune, that would mean that the mind is less fragmented. If they're less in tune, that would mean it's more fragmented. Okay. So, and here is here's the sad, kind of that's bad news about fragmentation, that it's the norm, it's not the exception. So the default is that your mind is fragmented. And not just fragmented in the kind of relatively harmless way that you're making that your mental state about your dental appointment and your mental state about meeting with a student, they are contradicting and they are clearly different fragments of your mind. but they're kind of, our mind is fragmented in a much more, much less harmless way. And one reason for this is that is something that is called the end of history illusion, and it's a fascinating finding in social psychology. So here's the thing: we all change. We all change very rapidly. That's a lot of good findings about this. So the kind of music that you liked 5 years ago is not the same as the kind of music you like now. Is that right? But other things as well. Even your personality traits are changing. There's a recent finding according to which your big 4 personality traits that are supposed to be the most constant thing in psychology, they actually change radically from even like a couple of decades in your life. So it's not so from introvert to extrovert or from extrovert to introvert. So that's not something that you can that just kind of remains unchanged either. So you change a lot, and I will say something. Did I? No, I won't. So I will say something about why we change. But just to see why that's important, why we should care about this, the main issue here and the relevance from the point of view of fragmentation is that while you change, your self-image does not change. And the end of history illusion is an illusion that we're all prone to, and that shows that what we think of us in 5 years, the kind of person we're going to be in 5 years, that is really just the person who we are now. So we are not acknowledging any possibility of change. So we all know that we like different music 5 years ago, but we all think that in 5 years we're gonna like the same music. So if our favorite band as of now in 2019 is gonna come to town and give a concert in 2014, we're gonna pay a huge amount of money for that, but the chances are very low that you're gonna actually like that concert in 5 years. So all right. So you see why that's an issue? Even if your mind is fully unfragmented and it's very, all your messages are in tune and everything is very much consistent with your self-image, given that your mind changes a lot and your self-image does not change, this means that eventually there's going to be a contradiction, even if there is no contradiction now. Because your self-image is fixed and the rest of the mind is fluid. Do you see that? So now now you see what's the relevance of this kind of change issue for the fragmentation business. Now let me try to give you some example about how we change and why we change and what's the, why we should be worried about that. Okay. So one important one important finding about change is the mere exposure effect. So the mere exposure effect is the phenomenon that just by being exposed to a certain stimulus, it's going to make you like that kind of stimulus a little more. So if you, and that goes for any kind of stimulus, and it also goes for unconscious stimulus, so stimulus that you're not conscious of, stimulus that goes under the radar. So if you like, I don't know, early Baroque music, and that's the kind of thing that you like, but you go to the mall and they're playing Justin Bieber, just that is going to change your musical preferences a little bit in the direction of Justin Bieber. It's disconcerting stuff. So just to give you a autobiographical example that's Turkey related. So I was traveling a lot in Turkey 19 years ago, and I took a lot of buses because that was the only thing you could do. And they always play, it was in 2000, and they always, apparently that's a golden period of Turkish pop, and they just played a lot of Turkish pop on those long, many hour bus rides. So my musical preferences were seriously shifted during that period. Some of the tunes are still kind of stuck in my mind. Alright, so that's the mere exposure effect. And again, that's something that happens to the things that some people they really care about the most. Either they taste in art, they taste in music, and so on. And again, so most of these changes, they happen in such a way that you're not aware of it. So your self-image is still that you are you're the kind of person who like this or that. But because of the mere exposure effect, you're actually slightly, your taste changes. Here's another example for change that happens kind of under the radar. And it's even more depressing, if anything. I realize that this is not an uplifting talk so far, but I'll just wait to tell you. And this is about desire frustration. So if you don't get what you want, that has two effects. One of them is that you want it more. That's hardly surprising. If you denied what you want, you just really wanted to get it. But there's a couple of relatively new experiments that show that there's another thing that happens, namely that when you actually get it, so you're trying to get something and you get frustrated and you keep trying it, it just doesn't happen. But for the 7th try, you do get it. Then you're gonna like that thing less. So desire frustration is to wanting something more, but then liking it less. Which is really not a very good outcome. So let's suppose that you're trying to run a marathon in under 3 hours, and you just fail. It's always 3:02, 3:01. And then finally, after the 10th attempt, you manage to run it in 3 hours. And then you change your whole diet, you change your whole daily routine in order to do that. And then when you actually achieve it, it's just not gonna. It's gonna be okay. So that's not a. That's a kind of change. That's about something that you really care about, and it happens under the radar. And again, your self-image is still remains unchanged. In the marathon example, you're still the kind of person who's really into running, but when you're actually achieving your goal, that's just not going to be a very satisfying outcome. There's a number of other psychological phenomena about how we change, but these are kind of the two most salient ones. So again, why this is a problem? Because we change, our self-image doesn't change, so eventually, even if there weren't much tensions between your self-image and the rest of your mind, there will be. So at this point you might ask, so haven't I heard this before? Isn't this just kind of warmed up Freud? And I think it's not at all. So Freud does talk about the repression of various desires into the unconscious, but that's a very different claim from the one that I'm making. The fragments in the fragmented mind that I'm talking about, they're not necessarily unconscious. In fact, most of the time they are conscious. They're very much conscious. Is this a good thing or is this a bad thing compared to the Freudian picture? Well, in some sense it's a bad thing, because that means that Freud didn't even know the half of it. So yeah, some of the bad things that happen to us, we kind of suppress it to the subconscious. But there's all this other thing, all these other mental states that we have that we are not pushed down into the subconscious, but nonetheless they are kind of exiled into different fragments. But that's the good news, is that Freud suggested a couple of things that we can do with suppressed memories and suppressed desires. They don't really work super well, as far as we know. But there's a lot more things that you can do with conscious mental states. So that's some kind of fun. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is the hidden cost of being a jerk. So no one really wants to think of themselves as a jerk. So you don't want to be the person who, who, I don't know, you find a wallet in a dark metro station and no one's looking, and you just kind of pocket it and not giving it back, or there's a cab outside the airport, and there's this old lady wanting to get in. You also want to get in, and just push you aside and get in. So why not being a jerk? I mean, in some sense, it's good. It's good for you. If you find a wallet and there's money in it, you're richer. That's just a good thing, no? And you get the cab. So supposing that you don't have some kind of religious reason or some kind of strong philosophical reasons to be a good person, or that you're not obsessively watching the TV show Good Place, then why not? Why not be a jerk? But what I want to say is that there's, even if you don't go with any of these kind of religious or moral reasons, there's a kind of psychological reasons why it's worth not being a jerk. And it's that being a jerk leads to fragmentation. Being a jerk leads to a more fragmented mind. So let's suppose that you just pushed aside that lady, that old lady, and then get in a cab. This is a memory that you have, but this is probably not a memory that you want to contemplate a lot. So what you're trying to do with it is you try to really exile to a faraway fragment of your mind, and try to prevent that faraway fragment to interact much with your self-image, because you don't want to think, you don't want this memory of yours that when you blatantly behave like a jerk to influence your self-image, because very few people are happy to somehow, they're kind of self-confident, self-declared jerks. So if you are, whenever you behave like a jerk, what you have to do with this memory is that you have to somehow exile it to a faraway fragment. But then that leads to more fragmentation. And then one thing I didn't tell you about the whole fragmentation thing, which is a very important thing, is that it's not when you're kind of exiling a memory into a fragment like that. It's not enough to exile it like that. You also have to kind of keep it exiled, keep it fragmented, keep it away from your self-image. And that's going to play a big role when you come back to the temptation thing. How much time? So I've been talking for half an hour, for 25 minutes? Half an hour, okay. So maybe I'm not going to talk about epistemic bubbles. Maybe I will talk about epistemic bubbles just a little bit. So epistemic bubbles, the way, and that's an important thing these days, in the age of fake news, you're often trying to keep away from the news outlet of the other side of the political spectrum. So if you're a Democrat, then you're probably not trying to not watch Republican media outlets, you're not going to watch Fox News. And if you do, you are going to kind of try to dismiss what you hear there by just for the reason that it's coming from Fox News. And so and because of this, people have argued that we've been more and more living in these epistemic bubbles. And as the Democrats, they live in these kind of Democrat epistemic bubbles, so there's no information coming in from the other side is going to make it through the boundaries of this bubble. But I don't think that's really true. What happens is that, of course, the information does get in. You do know what the other side is saying. It's very difficult not to know it. It's not that you're completely oblivious of what the other side is saying. It's that what you are trying to, the information that's coming from the other side, what you're trying to do with it is that you are trying to, again, fragment it away, trying to exile it to a different fragment. They just, okay, I have this information, but I don't want to integrate with the rest of my worldview. And then, of course, I have a good, I have a good reason for that, namely that this information is coming from Fox News, it's probably unreliable and so on. But nonetheless, that information is still in your mind. It's still working there. And it still kind of gives you more mental work to somehow try to keep it away from your general Democrat worldview. And a similar kind of story goes with for implicit bias. So implicit bias is, there are biases that go against your deeply held beliefs. So you might think that you're the least racist person in the universe, but nonetheless, when you're in the elevator, you stand a little further away from one person than from another person, depending on their skin color. And implicit bias has long been considered to be an unconscious bias, so just something that you're completely unaware of. And that recently there's been questioned, and for good reasons. But I think that, and I think there's good empirical reasons to think that implicit bias is not fully implicit, because you're often very much aware of that. You're standing a little further away, and you are actually, you know that what you're doing. But again, given that your self-image, that you're the least racist person in the world, that's not something that you want to confess to. That's not something that you want to say that, yeah, that's who I am. I'm standing further away from the black dude. What you do with this information about yourself, that's just how you behave, that again, you're trying to exile it as far away in your mind as possible. So that again leads to further fragmentation. So this leads to what is known in philosophical terminology as a double whammy. So the problem is that if your mind is fragmented, then keeping it fragmented takes a lot of effort. So if your mind is fragmented, then you're going to have these no-go areas in your mind. When you shouldn't really kind of venture there, because that's going to really threaten your self-image or what you think of yourself. So in some sense, fragmentation could be thought as this kind of part of this psychological immune system that you have. You're protecting your core beliefs about yourself by means of making the mind more fragmented. But again, that takes effort. And we know this from a number of empirical studies, some of which have been replicated, some of which haven't been, that if you deplete your mental energy, then you're very prone to give in to temptations. So if you're doing a lot of mathematical calculations, and just really annoying, like tiring, depletes your mental energy, then afterwards you go for the chocolate cake and not for the fruit bar. And there's been a lot of kind of theory made out of this under the rubric of ego depletion. And there's been a lot of problems with ego depletion, but the findings themselves, I mean, at least some of the findings that I want to rely on, they're okay. So again, I'm not endorsing ego depletion theory, but this still is the case that if you have very little mental energy left, then you're much more prone to resisting temptations. So really what happens here is that if your mind is fragmented, then you're going to have difficulties avoiding temptations. That is true by definition, just by how we talked about fragmentation. And if your mind is fragmented, then that's going to make it difficult for you to resist temptation as well. So what you're going to do? So I want to turn to an authority on temptation, and that's Oscar Wilde. And so far I talked about this direction. So if your mind is fragmented, then that's going to lead to decreased ability to resist temptation. Well, how about the other way around? And Oscar Wilde has a very famous and rightly famous quote here that goes like this: "The only way to get rid of temptation is to yield to it. Resist it and your soul grows sick with longing for the things it has forbidden to itself," and so on. So I think that this is, in some ways, what he describes as the soul growing sick with longing for the things it has forbidden to itself. That is a pretty good description of fragmentation. So really the point that Oscar Wilde is making is that it's not just the case that fragmentation leads to this decrease in the ability to resist temptation, but the other way around. If you resist the temptation, that's going to actually make your mind more fragmented, and you can see how that's a vicious circle. The more fragmented your mind gets, the less you're going to be able to resist temptation. The less you resist temptation, the more fragmented your mind is going to get. And that's some experimental support for this Oscar Wilde finding. So, all right, but then what can we do? So resisting the temptation is not a good idea. Just make your mind more fragmented. Should we just give in then? Well, that's what Oscar Wilde seems to suggest, and that's a terrible idea. So in some cases, especially in kind of chemically underwritten addictions, it is a fatal idea, because that's, giving in to temptation for a drug addict is going to lead eventually to death in certain drugs. But even in non-behavioral addictions, there's a lot of nice findings, quite recent, that, for example, the more you lie, the more likely you're going to be to lie again. So yielding, giving into temptations is going to reinforce a habit, and then that habit can then again, given that people tend not to like to think of themselves as liars or as addicts, they again lead to fragmentation. And here's, given that I did Oscar Wilde, I should also underrate, so here's a very nice quote by him. So the first time you steal something, you need to make some kind of decision to do so. Second time, you need to yield to temptation. Every time after that, it's just not paying attention. So it's really, so yielding temptation is also not a very smart move. So again, resist, more fragmentation. Yield, more fragmentation, and also establishing terrible habits. So what you have to do? Well, again, the hidden option, avoid temptations. But then the question is how you can do that. And again, what I was trying to say all along is that avoiding temptation just means it cannot happen unless you are good at having a relatively less fragmented mind. but then how to do that? And here is a lot, including Freud and stuff. Lots of people have focused on the desire side, say the self-image, and then you have to somehow bring your desires in tune with your self-image. And that's the whole Buddhist revival and mindfulness revival, that how somehow you have to kind of tone back your desires. I'm not sure that really works very well. So my bet would be to do this the other way around. Not to try to change your desires, but try to change your self-image. And try to change your self-image in such a way that it's less of a fixed self-image, that you think of yourself that I am a philosopher who's vegan and who likes golf and who is supporting Arsenal and so on. And I am that kind of person, have this kind of very strictly defined self-image, because as we've seen, who I am is actually going to move on from that, and if the self-image gets stuck, then it's just going to lead to more fragmentation. So the best thing that you can do about the fragmentation of your mind is to have a less fixed self-image. So again, not mess with the desire part of the contradiction, but with the self-image part. So I'm not saying that this is an easy thing to say. I think there's a kind of a natural propensity in all of us to have this kind of attribute, these essential properties to ourselves. And I talked about this a little bit with the end of history illusion, with that we just kind of think of ourselves that this is who I am. Who I am is going to be the day when I die. I'm going to have the same preferences as the way I am, which is just false. So maybe if we can come to grips to that can help with fragmentation. Teşekkür.
All right, now we will take questions, but please wait for the mic, right? So then you can talk to the mic. And so normally what sometimes people do is they take the names from the audience and then they, call on people based on the list, but I like chaos, so just, and then, this is easy.
Okay, so I wanted to ask about something you said right near the beginning, where you said trait self-control is about sort of the extent to which your desires line up with your self-image. And I wasn't sure whether that was intended as a thesis about trait self-control or as something akin to a definition. But in any case, I sort of worried about the following thing. I think it might be from Oscar Wilde, or it might be from Dorothy Parker, or something like this. There's the famous quotation, I can resist everything but temptation. So imagine Oscar Wilde saying that. Okay. Seems as though, that's the paradigm of the kind of person of whom we're going to say, not only have they got low trait self-control, they've got absolutely no trait self-control whatsoever. Right? They can't resist any temptation at all. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem right to say of this person that there's a conflict between their desires and their self-image. After all, their self-image is fashioned in exactly such a way that there can't be any conflict between their desire and their self-image. Their self-image is precisely of the person that yields to every desire no matter what. So I'm wondering, is there some way we're thinking about self-image that excludes that as a possibility? Or what's going on there?
Good, so I think, so it's a fair point. But what I would say is that the person, so let's suppose that then Oscar Wilde is at least pretending to be that kind of person, or at least in some of his fictional characters. So the person who just doesn't have any kind of moral code and just does whatever they want and gives into temptation. In that sense, in a life of someone like that, there is no such thing as temptation. It depends on how you understand temptation. But temptation, at least from Fisk, it seems like something that you are tempted to do that you know that you shouldn't do. But and the kind of Oscar Wilde fictional character, like the main character of the project of Dorian Gray, it's not the case. There's something they want to do, but they don't not want to do it. They're absolutely fine with doing it. So I think that they might not actually have temptation. So again, I think that there's a reason why we can only find kind of fictional examples for this, because it's very difficult to have that kind of flexibility in your self-image. So at the end, what I was trying to kind of urge is some kind of make your self-image less flexible, but you can't make your self-image like so flexible that it really changes with your desires, because in that case there is no, I mean, if that were the case, that's a kind of reduction of the absurdum. That means that there is no, that the whole concept of temptation just no longer makes sense, right? So that's what I would say about this.
Okay, I think this is related in some ways to Bill's, but one worry I've got is that you have this sort of seemingly sort of Platonic assumption that unity and harmony of the soul is good and healthy, fragmentation and division is sort of, this is lack of health of the soul, it's bad. And then I have these sort of Hegelian thoughts that in a contradictory world, contradictions in thought can be a good thing. And I think you get contemporary versions of this in logic, like with kind of Graham Priest and all these paraconsistent logics. Some of our beliefs are going to be inconsistent, and if we're too worried about consistency, we're just going to be a mess. So we've got to, in some sense, relax our concern for consistency. And I think we get this with, okay, I want to be stereotypical here, but with the kind of stereotypical German academic who comes to Turkey and then has to deal with Turkish bureaucracy. And sometimes the bureaucracy here is a bit different from German bureaucracy, and often the rules are not as consistent. And sometimes for someone who's used great consistency and bureaucratic rules, it really drives them mad. And I've seen this happen a couple of times, yeah? And there you might think, yeah, that one thing is the degree to which we care about fragmentation and consistency. And maybe that's something, maybe what I'm saying is a way of saying what you said in your last slide, but then I think that you want to have the right type of fragmentation. So I think the way you're putting things, it seems to be fragmentation sort of bad and unhealthy, unity good, but it seems to me, no, to live in a messy world, our thinking has to be messy enough for the world. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think there's one very simple reason why fragmentation is bad and unity is good, and it has nothing to do with Plato. And it's nothing to do with these kind of aesthetic reasons that Plato gives. And it's just that keeping the mind fragmented takes a lot of mental effort. And that mental effort then is going to, if you have to somehow, all your mental effort is tied down into patrolling the borders between the various fragments, then you're not going to have any kind of mental effort to do anything else. That is the only reason why fragmentation is bad. So I don't have I'm fully. So fragmentation comes in various flavors, right? I mean, there's kind of the more harmless versions of fragmentation, like scheduling conflict, stuff like that. And those are not. They're probably not patrolled very carefully, and are not being. The mind doesn't really care that much about those things. So I don't think that kind of fragmentation is bad. So I don't. It's just this very specific reason why I think fragmentation is bad. No, but dealing with a messy world and how you're what you can do about this, yeah. World is messy, but I'm not sure that our dealing with it is gonna be dependent on how fragmented our mind is. And if our mind is fragmented, then because of that, our mental effort is tied down into keeping it fragmented and can't be used for anything else, then we're going to have difficulties in dealing with anything let alone the fragmented world, or also become the messy world.
I was just wondering, when you were talking about the desired frustration, and I thought about the effort justification right now, and then I thought, when I put so much effort into something, then wouldn't I be more tend to justify it and make myself happier with it? Why would the both of them would be different? And I didn't understand the underlying reason for why I got frustrated and I didn't like the results when I desire something that much, and I don't when I put so much effort.
Yeah. So again, desire frustration has these double consequences. One of them is that you like it more, and that has a lot to do with effort justification, in some sense, right? So you're trying to, I don't know, yeah, the main example is run the marathon under, I don't know, 4.5 hours. Not run the marathon, great. 3.5 hours, is that realistic? And then you just can't do it, That just means that you really want to do it more. And there's a set of experiments, and so it's not supposed to be a philosophical reasons why it leads to liking it less, liking the outcome less. It's an empirical reason. So the idea is that people were, their desire was frustrated, and then when they got the thing that they wanted, they were trading it away much more easily than they did if they got it for the first time. I don't think there's an a priori argument for why that's the case. It's just the case in terms of just what the social psychology experiments are showing. So again, frustrated desire lead to stronger desires, but then when you get what you wanted, you're gonna like it less. So you want it more, like it less. It's kind of weird contradiction.
Thank you for this informative talk. We have talked about avoidance instead of resistance, but there's one question coming up. Does avoidance mean in any way an inability to deal with what we would face otherwise? And this fragments the mind further because it's there and still, we know what we have avoided already. I think this causes more fragmentation in some way. What do you think about this?
So I missed one step at the beginning. So avoidance means what?
I was talking about, we have opted for avoidance instead of resistance, right? Yes. But does avoidance also mean that we have some kind of inability to resist something? That's why we are avoiding it totally, and this fragments the mind further.
Oh, I see. Nice. So the idea is that you're avoiding something because you actually know that if you are putting yourself in that situation, then you couldn't resist it.
It is
So
there.
that means that this is a good. I think that you can avoid something for a number of reasons, and that might be one of the reasons. But I think the reason why I like this question is that I was kind of pretending that avoiding and resisting are these radically different things, but they're not. Just walking in front of the bar, or walking next street, or walking looking to the bar and then go out, or looking there, sitting around. So there's a kind of a spectrum between avoiding and resisting, I think. And in the marshmallow case, funnily enough, that makes it even messier. So I said that it's blatantly about resisting, but really what the kids are doing, you can actually watch these videos. It's very painful, but you can watch them. And what the most successful kids are doing is something like avoiding. So they close their eyes, they look at the ceiling. So I was pretending that avoiding and resisting are this kind of radically different thing, but they're not really. So there's much more of a spectrum between them. So you're right about that.
Thanks for your talk. I had a question about the notion of self-image. It seems to me that there is some muddiness there between self-image and aspirational self-image, because you might very well know that you're the kind of person who drinks a lot, or is going to have that fifth beer, right? And so there's not really a conflict between your desire and your self-image, but it's something about you aspire to be the kind of person who doesn't have the fifth beer. And so then it's kind of not a conflict between a desire and a self-image, but between two different desires.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you're absolutely right. It's not about a descriptive self-image about who I think I am, but who I think I should be, or who I think what kind of person I want to think of myself as. And actually, that I think, and I'm going to talk about this tomorrow a little bit, the imagination is going to be a big part of it, who I imagine myself to be. So it's very much a normative concept, but it's a desire, not sure, you can phrase it like that, I mean I think it's a helpful way of phrasing it. So your desire about what kind of person you want to be, or what kind of person you imagine yourself to be, versus your desire for a beer. So absolutely, it's not a descriptive self-image, it's a normative or aspirational, it's nice. Self-image.
Okay, mine is a related question, but I thought the conflicts I usually experience, or the temptations, are not about the conflict between my desires and my self-image, but my short-term desires and my long-term desires, right? So it's not even, so I don't really have any self-image. I don't really think that much about my self-image, and I don't think there's children here in the marshmallow experiment have a self-image. So it seems like the conflict, the temptation is whether to give in to the immediate desires or whether they should set aside their long-term desires, right? So why do we just even talk about self-image in this picture?
Good. So I think that that's very true for so under a Humean conception that's very much the case, and that's very true for some temptations. And again, temptation was kind of our way into the whole fragmentation thing, and I think temptation is obviously there's very different kinds of temptations that you can have. Some of them are strict chemical bases, some don't. Some of them are very much dependent on habituation, some of them don't. So there's different kinds, and I didn't want to say anything that's going to be true for all temptations, and it's not supposed to be a theory of temptation. But I think at least in many tempting stimulus that we have, there is a conflict between, not just between what I want right now and what I want tomorrow. So right now I want to feel beer, but tomorrow morning I have to get up early to get to the airport or something, and then there's a blatant conflict between two desires, one is long term and the other is short term. But sometimes in some very important and often in the case of addiction, for example, very major conflicts, they are actually the conflicts between desire and self-image, again understood as a normative self-image. So maybe that's also a desire to decide who you want to be, what kind of person you want to be.
Okay, so you suggest that we can try to be more flexible, right?
Yes.
So I assume that I have a self-image, I think I have one. But if I try to be more flexible, then this seems to become a part of my self-image, right? So being flexible then now is a part of my self-image. So don't you think this creates a new problem?
Yeah, trying not to try is difficult. Yeah, I agree. So it's not supposed to, so that this was not supposed to be in spite of the microphone, it's not supposed to be an inspirational talk. So I don't really have a solution for you, I'm afraid. It's not that I want you to go home and then change your life and then, but I think that there's a huge problem that we all face, and there's a lot of reasons why we should care about that problem, and that's the least hopeless way of resolving that is to do something like your self-image. I'm not going to tell you how to do that, I'm afraid. Otherwise, I would, make big bucks with it.
So in the beginning, you talked a little bit how we have a tendency to have a fixed, stable self-image, but towards the end, you were encouraging us to have a more flexible self-image. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate more on how we're exactly supposed to do that.
Again, if I had an answer for you, I would do this for several thousands of dollars, but I mean, what I mean is this. So I think that we're making choices very often, not because we feel like making those choices, but because we know that these are the choices that the kind of person we consider ourselves to be will make. So here's a simple example. You go to your coffee, your cafe where you always go, and then you order an espresso. And why do you order an espresso? Well, very often it's because you're an espresso kind of person, or you know that. There can be other reasons. Like I know that they have their espresso is good, their cappuccino is bad, or you can think, wow, the woman is Italian and they're gonna judge me if I have a cappuccino after 11 a.m. So, but very often we make these choices because we know that the kind of person, depending on the basis of what I think of myself, the kind of person who I am an espresso person. I'm kind of order espresso, even though I might actually now feel like a cappuccino. So I think that there's a lot that we do because of this kind of fixed self-image, and of course we do very few things alone in life, and we tell our friends that I'm a coffee person, and then they're gonna bring me, they're gonna buy me coffee beans and coffee machines and books about coffee, or so that's gonna reinforce my importance of the importance of myself and so on. So I think it's a really important tendency in all of our life to kind of have a more and more stable self-image. And I don't know how to, I really don't have anything positive to say about how not to do that, but I just think just being aware that that's very often you're actually making decisions that are not particularly good for you just because you feel constrained by your self-image. That might be an important recognition to have.
Thank you.
Hi. So I want to ask you a question I think is in line with a lot of the comments that have been made, and it's about the ubiquity of this fragmentation and the ubiquity related to the type of fragmentation that leads to the bad kind, we'll say. For you, my understanding is that fragmentation is ubiquitous, and it's the bad kind that's ubiquitous. And so I'm wondering two things. One, how much of that ubiquity depends on the self-image being static? And two, so this relates a little bit to Sanye's question, a little bit to Lucas's question about, so take, drinking the fifth beer isn't a matter of dissonance between my aspirational self-image, etc. It's the fact that tomorrow I have to work. And so I wanted to ask, it's how dependent the ubiquity, and again, it's the ubiquity of the bad kind of fragmentation, depends on the static self-image, because a lot of the examples you give, I think, can go either way, and then when they start to go either way, I start to wonder, well, isn't this what we call psychopathology? So when you have the sort of dissonance in the fragmentation you're talking about, that's pathology, that's not everyday living, which I think isn't what you want to say. And the reason I'm asking how much the self-image needs to be static is because from a developmental perspective, I think you might find a fair bit of evidence to suggest that the self-image changes throughout development. Again, sort of depends what you mean by self-image exactly. But in part, this is why Freud gave a developmental account of personality, because he thought there was some minimal development involved. And today, I think we think there's a lot more development involved.
Great. So, very good. So it's really important. Maybe I overstated it, but I don't think that just by weakening your self-image, it's going to get rid of all the problems and it's going to get rid of all the bad kind of fragmentation. But that's just something that we can do and we can try. So again, it's not supposed to be. I'm not trying to suggest that that's the only. It's going to be a kind of a silver bullet for all the fragmentation-related problems.
I guess what if the self-image isn't static, and it's not static in pretty robust ways? Does that undermine the ubiquity of the fragmentation? Is that going to be a problem for you?
Oh, I see. So what if someone's like Bill's might go to random names, right? Bill's mind is really has a non-very stable self-image, and then.
Well, but I won't go fantastic lives. I mean, again,
what if for everyone?
I don't know for sure you guys self-image, but
okay.
Starting from infancy, preschool, into early childhood, etc. There's going to be lots of ways in which we talk about your self-concept, your self-image, changing and developing. But I think it's at least open to culture, because that's how you get the sort of normative aspect to this, say, I'm violating it. And so to the extent that then it develops, is this maybe then just a model of adult fragmentation and not a matter of earlier?
Definitely. So I think, I think it's a really interesting question how that works in childhood, but this is also supposed to be about grown-ups. Because I'm fully with you that I don't think that kids' self-image is particularly strong. In fact, there are periods like the teenage years where there's a very important attempts to somehow figure out what your self-image is, right? So, and there's a lot of fluctuation and a lot of trying this kind. So I don't want to make any claims about developmental perspective.
All right, so we have time for one more question.
Okay, so I was thinking, I like the idea that you go the other way around rather than desire management, self-image management. But unfortunately, you didn't really speak a lot about what self-image is. And to me, it seems like my first temptation is, I'm tempted to think that, I like this idea, this Sartrean idea that, it's really about the gaze of the other, which is fundamental. The Sartre thinks that that's not only, it's primordial, and it comes first, it's fundamental. Contrary to what we might think initially, namely that, I have a self-image, I'm the autonomous person. It's really the others, who build, this so-called self-image. So what if we distinguished, as we do in philosophy, for fun, between two kinds of self-image, one in which you are aware that it's really extrinsic, it's not intrinsic to you because it's really the other that builds it. And that wouldn't, you wouldn't be able to change that because, what can you do about it? And the kind of self-image which is, if it exists at all, which we think maybe, not we, but, because we are philosophers, but, ordinary people think that they have, right? People who didn't restart. So do you think this would lead to some kind of enrichment of this idea of how exactly this would be possible, to relax this self-image? So there's maybe some kind of complexity to the idea of self-image.
Definitely. So let me actually bring together the two last questions because there's a kind of a new and really cool account in developmental psychology about the development of the self that's given by Victoria Southgate in Copenhagen, who has this idea that really it's the other that so when kids are when infants under 1.5-year-olds, they really are interested in the other person's perspective, not in their own perspective. And the whole kind of self-stuff only develops at 18 months. And you can make sense of a lot of the theory of mind findings, a lot of the infant theory of mind findings that way. So I think that's an interesting proposal, and it's Sartrean in some ways. And I also want to connect this back to the previous question that we have from the back about the self-image, where and in response I said that yes, the reason why our self-image is fixed. I mean, I'm not sure that the self-image itself is somehow is only the consequence of what other people are doing to us. But I think it really our interaction with other people definitely has a tendency of making our self-image more stable, because we have to somehow. I mean, it's just very difficult to interact with people if you're kind of always presenting a completely different side. I mean, in some ways you have to be predictable in some sense, and people will treat you as predictable anyway. So that's going to make you be even more predictable. Whether I want to go all the way to say that the only reason why there's a self-image, or a stable self-image, is because there's the gaze of the other or something like that. I'm not sure. That would be a pretty radical thing to say. So as a result, I don't think that the solution to all these problems is to just not talk to anyone, or just, even if you talk to them, just completely ignore what they think of you. Because if you're right, then that would be the way to go. I'm not sure that is the way to go. But I mean, one thing that's that's very clear is that I would need to say more about what self-image is, because I think that's a concept that's a very there's a lot of baggage historically, both in psychology and in philosophy. And psychologists, they when you use self-concept, that's already a very confusing and confused term. So maybe that's not such a lucky choice of words, because people will bring their theoretical baggage there. But again, what I mean by self-concept is just the kind of thing that I said in the espresso example, that you take yourself to be an espresso person, you take yourself to be a philosopher, and that's going to dictate your choices. And I think that's generally not a good idea.
Let's thank Professor Nanay one more time for the talk.